Hey, we are live. So today the topic is all things SPSS. I'm here with Bart Poulson. Bart, when you get things started, what is going on in your professional life in SPSS at the moment? I'm sure you're university teaching, but what else?
Well, that's the main part. I am by background a social psychologist. I have a PhD in social psychology, and I've been a full-time faculty member for over 20 years. And SPSS, which even though IBM kind of claims it doesn't stand for anything now, originally is Statistical Package for the Social Sciences. So this was something that was available when I was an undergrad in the 80s. Well, it's been available for a long time, and it's something that a lot of my colleagues use in their own research and that they use in some of their classes and that they're also having a lot of their students engage with. So that is my primary one, is using it when consulting with my colleagues and with their own students at the university, as well as occasionally advising people in settings outside of the university.
We've spoken, since we're both LinkedIn Learning authors, that's how we know each other. We were recently at a lovely get together, a LinkedIn Learning author reunion, which isn't in all senses a reunion because very often you're meeting colleagues for the very first time. So that's how we know each other. I'm actually curious. I'm going to tell everybody a little bit about what's going on with me and SPSS at the moment, but I'm curious about how you know us. Do you know what brought you here today? In other words, everybody, I would love to see that in the comments and where you're joining from. Do you perhaps know us from our LinkedIn Learning course? I actually have a Wiley for Dummies SPSS book. You may even know me from that. Who knows? We'd love to know what prompted you to join today and what your questions are. So, and something I didn't know about that just now, even though we've talked about this topic, is that it sounds like you become kind of an informal help desk for people that are using SPSS for research. That tends to happen to pretty much anyone that is identified as being SPSS knowledgeable on their campus. Once that gets out, the crowds form around you, whether it be someone's dissertation or what have you. What kind of stuff do people bring to you, do you find, once they figure out that you're the SPSS guy on campus?
Well, so we have two different groups. We have that I need to work with. One is I have my colleagues who are working with students, and the students are learning how to use SPSS for the very first time. And so one of the first things I do is I do point them to my course at LinkedIn Learning. Fortunately, my university has a site license, and so it's available to all of them for free. But I point them there first so they can get up and running. And really for them, it's like, how do I even enter the data and get the analyses done? Fortunately, it's a pretty easy program that way. I also have a collection of colleagues who are very, very skilled researchers, but in qualitative methods. And so the statistical part is new to them. They can do content analysis, they can do ethnography, they can do that stuff all day long. But occasionally they get told by a journal that they need to have some sort of quantitative analysis in there. And so I show them SPSS as a very common way of getting these analyses in. And again, it also means in those particular cases, they're pretty simple analyses, tabular databases or analysis of variance or something like that.
I want to acknowledge a couple of comments that we've gotten, Bart, but then I want to follow up on the ethnography, qualitative research. I think that's going to be very interesting. So something to announce right off the bat, for those of you that have come to these events, you know that we kind of like jump right in. We figured that you probably don't need introductions because you probably looked at our LinkedIn before you joined. So I've made that assumption. One assumption that I should acknowledge is that we're going to be talking a bit about SPSS statistics as well as SPSS modeler. So you might be familiar with one and not the other, but before the hour is out, we're going to be talking about them both. So want to now acknowledge Nicole, been a colleague of mine for many years. Thanks for coming, Nicole. And also Sanjay's joining from India. I guess it's seen my LinkedIn Learning course. And then Mule, we haven't chatted in quite a long time, but I remember the visit to Franciscan. I have fond memories of that. So thanks so much for joining, and a bunch of others joining as well. Marco from LA, for instance. So here's my follow-up question on the ethnographers. In data science, you hear, oh gosh, if you're not using R or Python, emphasis on Python, you're not doing data science. But if I was helping somebody with their master's thesis in ethnography, I can't imagine that they would want to take, 4 to 6 weeks, let's say, or more away from their other studies and other responsibilities to learn a programming language to analyze their qualitative data. Could you comment on that a bit? Because there are probably some folks that are wondering, wow, I remember SPSS from school, but is anyone still using it? I'm sure that somebody on the call is wondering that, right? Others, of course, are using it probably quite often, and they're not wondering that at all. But could you comment a bit on that?
Well, it lets you know, for instance, about the difference between the fields of data science and data analysis, even though there's a lot of overlap between them. And the way I think of it, data science really, being a large umbrella term, has changed what it means in practice over the years. And now when people say data science, they think something closer to machine learning engineering. And that will be, people who are developing algorithms to do a lot of automated processing, things like image classification or audio. Anyhow, basically everything that's amazingly cool in AI is some form of machine learning engineering, and they will often use a program like Python. I am capable of using Python. It is not my first choice because I come from a social science research background, and so I started with SPSS, with SAS, and then I eventually moved to R. But I wouldn't dream of telling my undergraduate students who are still trying to figure out the difference between a mean and a median that they need to start programming in R. I'm trying to help it so they can get the answers to their questions with as little, I hate to call it a distraction or diversion, but that's what it is. It's saying, like you said, well, you want to do this, but first you're gonna have to spend 40, 60 hours, learning how to do that. And so SPSS has the advantage of, again, it's people forget that drop-down menus exist for a reason because they make your life a lot easier. And also, and so that's one of the big advantages of SPSS, that for doing the basic analyses that a lot of these people are doing, again, it's variations on multiple regression, it's tabular data sets, it's t-test and analysis of variance and correlations. Most of that stuff's pretty basic. But you have a lot of options with it, especially when you get to something like multiple regression. And the SPSS has been a good way for them to get up and running with that within a few hours.
I'm gonna I can understand your hesitation because we're not here to slam something like machine learning libraries, right? But I will say that I'm quite comfortable calling it a distraction in the following sense. If you're talking about someone that is studying, applied area, it could be, let's say, Masters of Public Health, for instance, something like that, and maybe their program, or let's actually talk undergrad first. We could talk grad school later, right? And let's say that person is going to have 2 semesters of statistics required, maybe 3, let's say. Do you want to invest, and for an undergrad, it really would be a whole semester. Do you want to invest a semester of them learning Python grammar when they're going to follow that with 2 courses in stats? Now compare that to someone who's going to get a master's in data science. It's worth the investment to spend a semester on just Python basics, even if there's no statistics theory talked about at all, just getting in there and doing those kinds of things. If they're going to go on to a data science master's, and in fact, I don't think either of us could imagine a data science master's without Python, but that's really the difference. So, since a lot of data scientists follow us, it might be, wow, isn't everybody supposed to learn Python? Well, in data science, these days, if you're doing a data science grad school right now in 2023, again, it's hard to imagine that they're not going to learn Python as well as a number of other things as well. But if you are in in adjacent topic area as an undergrad or a master's, you've really got to be careful about thinking about, do I want to spend a half year or a year mastering a language that when that's not the primary reason, my primary topic of study? This comes up when I'm doing my continuing ed stuff at UC Irvine all the time, was we debate this. And I say, well, okay, fine, someone's going to do a whole course in Python, but what's coming after that? What are they going to use the Python with? And if it's a 3-course certificate, I think it's insane for the first course in a 3-course certificate to be Python, unless it's some kind of machine learning warm-up, a try it before you buy it type certificate, then maybe it makes sense. I would love to get everybody's 2 cents on that. Is that pretty much where you're coming from with it, Bart?
Yeah, I think of it as learning a programming language is very helpful for people who are going to be working with data on a daily basis. That is their job. But for instance, most of my colleagues, you might say, they are researchers. They touch data, but their focus is on the topic that they're working with, not the method. And so using the tool that allows them to get the insight for their method and to write their papers, that's going to be the important part for them. And especially, geez, I think about, again, my friends who are qualitative researchers. That's such extensive training. I would hate for them to think that I have to go through an ethnography training in order to read the student feedback I get each semester, which would be kind of an
Oh my
equivalent
gosh,
thing.
and SPSS can be so good at that. I remember, you'll appreciate this. We run the risk of getting in the weeds, but I remember, if I had a lot of just, like a comment field, I'll always use the length function, because, people forget that SPSS actually has substantial amount of programming ability, whether or not it's just doing simple functions or working in the syntax window, things that both of us talk about in our LinkedIn Learning courses related to SPSS. Syntax can totally be your savior if you learn just a little bit. But I used to use the length function, and I could easily generate a Boolean that just simply said, was a comment present or not? And I could do super simple things like do a t-test to say whether average satisfaction was higher or lower for people that provided comments, or take, maybe divide my ratings into fifths or something, quintiles,
The quintile.
and then just say, what are some comments from the top and the top quintile and the lowest one? You don't have to do something fancy like text mining to do that. You can do some very simple stuff by just pulling out comments that are interesting because it was your highest rating or your lowest rating or something like that, and then putting them in a report. In fact, I used to do that when I taught SPSS classes for SPSS Inc. before the IBM buyout. And over the course of the year, I would have well over 1,000 survey, entries, and I'd have the overall thing. Every entry would be a participant. Now, clearly, not everyone's going to leave a comment, right? So I wanted to have something that my managers could sit down with me for, and I could have the average and say, what was a comment that was typical of somebody that really enjoyed the class? What was a comment that was typical of somebody that had some constructive criticism? And I was do that wonderfully in SPSS, and the whole operation would take me maybe 30 or 45 minutes. Somebody who's trying to do something like that, it'd be crazy for them to spend a month, learning something much more advanced if they're not going to use the advanced features. I'm actually curious.
Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say about comments. I want to hear your comment as well. But everybody that's watching, we've got a lot of comments about people joining from a whole bunch of different places. Since we were just talking about discipline like ethnography and data science and so on, if you could share your current role, how you use SPSS or how you aspire to use SPSS, that would be really interesting. Do you use it in education? Do you use it in data science? Are you in one of these related or adjacent fields? Yes, so Bart, sorry to interrupt, but I just want
no, I'm watching the comments because I want to see that too. And thank you to those of you who are up late at night watching this. I appreciate that. It's still the morning for me. But it's funny, you just mentioned sometimes the simplest things make the biggest difference. I remember when I was trying to learn R, I actually was paying somebody to give me lessons. This was a long, long time ago. And he never, this is really embarrassing to say, he never told me that you could save a script. He had me writing everything in the command line every time in the console. Or he would have us, put stuff in a Word document and then copy and paste the command from the Word document into the console. When I learned that you could, like in R, you can save a script and you can
Yeah.
run that, and like, this makes all the difference in the world. But it's the same thing in SPSS. I think it was probably a year before I really learned how to use the syntax files. Those of you who use SPSS, hopefully you know about this, that obviously you have the data window and you have the output window, but you can also have a third window, the syntax window, which allows you to save the commands, which I find to be, priceless for, for several reasons. Number one, it lets you rerun the command. You can save all your work, you can save what you've done, you can rerun the command. Second, you can use the drop-down windows to set up an analysis, and then you can paste it into syntax. So it creates it. It actually writes all the code for you, and you can adapt that as you need. And then SPSS has like certain little Easter egg features that are only available through syntax, and that there is no menu for them. So you have to already know that they exist. But if you do that, then you can enter them through the syntax, the programming language that is in SPSS.
Yeah, no, that's a really powerful one. Not everybody knows that. I think the key for folks to understand is that the syntax came first, right? It sounds like we both started using SPSS around the same time, late 80s, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
We've been at this for a similar amount of time, and at that point, SPSS for Windows was well established, but SPSS was already decades old when we started using it. And I bet we both have friends that initially used SPSS with the punch cards. In fact, we were joking about the other day is no one wants to drop the box of punch cards. That's like the classic old story about that time period.
Mm-hmm.
But syntax goes back to the punch card days. So the menus were basically a way to develop your syntax more quickly. But it was a process that occurred over many, many years. So in the early days of the menus, and as someone that SAS has been part of my career, and that I've been on projects where others are using SAS, or actually where clients were migrating from SAS to SPSS. When I did training for SPSS Inc., I had to do that. But I think you've used SAS more, it sounds like, right? And there was a time when the Windows version was young, that it couldn't do everything that SPSS could do. And the feeling from some in the SAS community, sometimes it was kind of an uncharitable characterization sometimes, is, oh, SPSS is kind of a toy because it doesn't have the power that SAS has. But it usually was comparing the full SAS programming language to what the early Windows versions could do, and not comparing the SAS programming language to what SPSS syntax could do. That's probably in the past now, but it's interesting to note that there was a period for a few years like that, where there was seen to be not just a difference in feature, that's always been the case, but like an order of magnitude difference in features because of that. Nicole is just mentioning, Nicole, of course, has been doing this for a long time. 30 years. Nicole, are you implying that I've been doing it for 30 years too? Which would be true, and it makes me feel old. Muley, it's interesting. Quite a few are, looks like, are in healthcare. In fact, I think, Nicole, a lot of your clients over the years have been healthcare. Am I remembering that right? Well, also education, public sector, but I think probably all of us have. I mean, healthcare analytics is just such a big area, but Muley is mentioning that is, kind of dabbled in R and Python, but hasn't gotten too deep. Into that. But I think for the reasons that we were saying, right? So you could even elaborate a bit, Muley, in the chat if you wanted to. It's probably because SPSS is getting you what you need to get out of it, right? Doing the kinds of analyses that you have to do in a hospital environment as a data analyst.
Keith, I'm going to expand on that. It's a theme that I tell my students both at the university and on LinkedIn is I see a sequence to working with data tools. And what it is, I say start with spreadsheets. It's the simplest, easiest thing. I have hundreds of spreadsheets on my computer, and if your question could be answered easily in a spreadsheet, do it that way. But as soon as that's no longer an easy tool to use, like if you're going to try to do a regression, it's possible to do it in a spreadsheet, but it's a pain. As soon as it becomes difficult, then go to a statistical app, SPSS, and there are several other options where you get the menus, but they are developed specifically for the statistical functionality. And then there may come a time when what you're trying to do is not easy to accomplish in that. If you are doing deep learning neural networks, SPSS can't do it. And so it's when you get to a point where the app is no longer convenient, then you go to a language. So I have, my personal thing is spreadsheets and then apps and then languages. And so it gets to the point is, remember the point is not how to know how to use a tool. Your whole goal is to get insight out of your data. And there is a very large sweet spot where an app like SPSS is an ideal tool because it lets you go beyond. I mean, even when I'm using SPSS, I still have people enter the data. If they're entering data manually, we still enter it in a spreadsheet. And then from there, we import it into SPSS because it makes the analysis scalable and repeatable, and it makes it a lot easier to get the functions that we can't get otherwise. I'm the only time when I'm working with my colleagues at the university, I will occasionally go to R on my own. And I do that because the data manipulation in dplyr is a lot easier for me to use. And so if I have to change the data set, it's often easier for me to just take it to R very quickly, do the manipulations there, and then bring it back to SPSS for my colleagues. So, but I don't stay in R in those situations.
Remind me, is dplyr also a Hadley Wickham library? Okay, yeah, I'm gonna ask you to comment on him a little bit in a moment because he really is super influential in the R community. So a little bit of a warm up to that though. So get ready for a multi-part question. Ready? First, I want to ask those of you that are attending whether or not you've tried SPSS syntax. So in other words, the programming language within SPSS. I think we're both going to be curious about that because we can make some comments about that. And then Bart, I warned you at the beginning, we're not exactly sticking to a script here, but I did want to ask you about your SPSS origin story. And then after that, I want to talk about really both of us talk about SPSS syntax a little bit more and when you use SPSS syntax and when you use R. And before you know it, I want to also talk about what's in your course because it's the first course in the SPSS learning path that we both have courses in. So again, your comments, everybody, on SPSS syntax, and it can be just as simple as I've tried SPSS, but I haven't tried syntax yet. It's when you're typing. Actually, you're usually not typing it. You're usually clicking what's called the paste button, and it sends the code to the syntax window. Then you can save it and modify it, but you probably shouldn't just be staring at a blank syntax window to use SPSS. It's so much easier to start with paste. So how about your SPSS origin story, and as part of that, your syntax origin story, because most SPSSers have a syntax origin story too.
Okay, so I can tell you, interestingly, I come to SPSS from SAS. When I was doing my undergraduate back in the 80s, and I was starting to work with some professors on their research in psychology, they were using SAS. And so I took a 1-credit course in SAS, which, by the way, because it was the 80s, was on the mainframe. And we used that. And then when I went to graduate school in the early 90s, I started with SAS. But what was funny is we came across a data problem that nobody knew how to solve. And this was before the internet. And what it was uh, we had in our data set cases where the data took more than one row, because it was like a repeated measures kind of study, but we had um, and nobody at my school knew how to handle that in SAS. I'm sure SAS can do it, because these are very flexible, powerful, but nobody knew how to do it in SAS. But we knew how to set it up in SPSS, and so that is the point at which I was still at a very elementary level, so it didn't take long for me. I mean, to take my tiny bit of knowledge of SAS and then move over to SPSS, and then I never looked back from that.
Can't resist a follow-up question, because these two scenarios differ considerably in complexity. So I don't know what kind of study it was, but let's say there was a study where you and I were going to go somewhere every week to get our blood pressure taken, maybe some kind of blood pressure reducing medication or something. And maybe I had 7 measurements and you had 9. So you couldn't be certain of the number of measurements. Was it like that? Or was it guaranteed that you would have 8 and I would have 8?
I think in this one, it was a strict experimental scenario. And so everybody had like exactly 2 rows of data. Now,
Okay.
looking at it now, it would have just made more sense to take that second row and stick it on the side, make it a wide data set. And it also, it's one of those things that, like, if right now that happened to me today, that would take like 30 seconds to fix using dplyr and R, and then I could get back to where we were before. Anyhow,
Well, if it was a strict, everybody absolutely without exception gets 2 rows, it's also a 30-second problem in SPSS, but not one that everybody certainly would be familiar with. If it's a differing number of rows, it's more complicated in SPSS and dplyr, I would assume, right? You've got some kind of a
yeah,
loop, some kind of an if statement, but that's the kind of thing that is often someone's SPSS syntax origin story, is they got stuck.
mhm.
Went to the help menu and there wasn't anything in the menu, but maybe there was something like C, the XYZ command and the syntax command reference. And you go, oh my gosh, what's that? And then hopefully there's a friend that can kind of put you on the right
Yeah,
path.
and again, this was early 90s. I was working on a Mac Classic 2 with a 9-inch black and white screen, and it had my ping dial-up modem, and people were using AOL. The internet as we know it didn't exist, and I actually read the paper manuals. And so we had the giant paper manuals and just kind of going through all that, trying to figure it out. In terms of syntax, I actually don't remember when I started using syntax. I just know that eventually I picked it up and said, like, oh, wow, now I can save all my work and I can set up the analysis while we're still gathering the data in an experimental design that's easy to do. And just how monumentally easy it made my work, and also sharing my work with other people. There's the little joke about spreadsheets. I do yeah, I still have my paper manuals.
I do too.
It's there's the joke about spreadsheets, that point and click doesn't scale. And even though I strongly recommend spreadsheets for one-off sorts of things, being able to redo my analyses. So I see, I can't tell if anybody's said whether they've used the syntax window, but seriously,
Yeah, a
it
couple of
makes a
folks have.
difference.
So you want to make sure you're on the comments tab and not the private chat tab, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I am on comments here. Yes,
And
anyhow,
Muley mentioned that he's dabbled but never really gotten into syntax. And then Nicole, of course, has been at this for many years. Nicole and I have known each other for a long time. And she mentions the custom tables module, right? So I could not agree more. Not everybody's going to know what custom tables are, right? Because it's interesting how SPSS implements this. Do you have a little since you have the fundamentals course, Bart? I'm fortunate that I can rely upon the knowledge that you share in the fundamentals course, and then go on to some more, well, regression is not exactly a niche topic, but you know what I mean. I can build upon what you do there. I think you mentioned the add-ons, don't you? Because it can be confusing how they work.
I mentioned that they exist.
Yeah.
Now, one of the challenges of SPSS is I do have to spend like an entire video outlining the SPSS universe. We have many different, there's and lots of different packages, lots of different releases, and just kind of know which one you're dealing with. I mentioned the add-ons. I also mentioned that it's possible to run R and Python in SPSS. I mentioned the add-ons, but I don't use them. Not in the introductory course. Save that for you.
Yeah. Well, and I actually just did an updated recording. So this is going to kind of be an exciting bit of news that Bart knows, and my content manager, we call them, and LinkedIn knows, but almost no one else knows. Around July or so, there will be a new version of my regression course. And in it, I'm going to talk about the extensions. Now, this sends us down a rabbit hole, but the add-ons and the extensions aren't the same. So what Bart and I, or even Nicole, was just calling an add-on is it's basically an additional purchase you make. The extensions are a little bit different because Python is open source. So if you are using a Python extension, it's free, but you have to know that it's there. So specifically, what I'm going to be demonstrating in a new chapter in my regression course is ridge, regression, lasso, and elastic net, which are implemented using Python. But if you just click and it says, oh, you can't do this because you have to install the extension, and then you might not even know what that is, but you say, okay, and you click on next and so on. Next thing you know, there's a new menu available to you that looks just like SPSS and produces output just like SPSS, but it's actually being implemented through Python. So that's kind of exciting. So if you've never encountered that before, I'm sure it's going to be on LinkedIn Learning. It will say new update or whatever, and it will certainly be in my feed. But there's going to be a new chapter added, but just kind of keep your eyes out for those alternatives to OLS regression, basically, all in their own chapter, and it's going to be implemented with Python. But you wouldn't even know it. You don't have to know a word of Python to implement that. You just have to follow the instructions through the menus, and it installs a bit of Python. Actually, Python's being installed when you install SPSS now. And if you're not a Python person, you wouldn't even know that. But that makes it available so that these extensions can be written. And there are R extensions as well. So,
and I just want to plug just for a second here for the people who are watching. If you're not familiar with these variations on regression, ridge, lasso, and elastic net, they are fabulous methods for solving a lot of very, very common problems, specifically about like variable selection, that people usually try to answer sort of like on a, let's try this, let's try that, let's try this, let's try that kind of method. They're fabulous methods. And especially if you're doing applied work, I strongly recommend that when this course comes out, that you take a look at that, because these can be great things to add to your to your toolkit in SPSS. So, Keith, when did you say that course is going to be released? You said July, maybe?
It's already recorded. I'm thinking July.
Okay. Well, I hope people will watch for an announcement when that comes out, because that's going to be a great thing to add to what they're able to use with data.
Yeah, and I remember we were talking about that because we were trying to figure out, should you add something to your fundamentals course, or should I add something to regression? It felt like it belonged more in regression, but of course I try to do all of that
and run through them extremely quickly, but mostly point them over to your regression course.
Well, and even in the regression course, I've added between 15 and 20 minutes, which is not. I mean, it could be an entire short course. Collectively, they're called shrinkage methods, everybody. We won't head down that path now, but the reason, by the way, that they're in the new regression course, because regression's not new. We all know that it's been around for a long time. Those three algorithms are new to SPSS precisely because they've been implemented through Python. But once you install them, it looks like anything else in SPSS. So at the risk of confusing things a little bit, that was the extensions. The add-ons, sometimes called the modules, often called the modules, are different. Well, how are they different? Well, I mean, the quick version is the extensions are open source. There are Python. The modules are not. They're an additional purchase. Oh, Zechariah has an interesting question. I need to know, when do we need to use Python? Well, I'm going to answer in two ways, and I think I'm going to also, Zechariah, I think I'm going to go ahead and make a quick comment about finish my thought about the modules. But if it's, do you need to learn Python to use the extensions? I'm thankful to report that the answer is no. You just simply follow the instructions in SPSS, and that's it. You never even see the Python. If your question is, when might you outgrow SPSS and feel you need Python? If you're doing statistics, I mean, I'll speak as somebody that's been using SPSS all my career. If it really is statistics that you're doing, analysis of variance, MANOVA, regression, we just mentioned things like even like elastic net and so on. If that's your jam, if you're a statistics person, you're never going to outgrow SPSS. If, however, you want to do computer vision, certain kinds of natural language processing, if you're doing text mining, you can do that in SPSS Modeler. But if you're talking something like Amazon Alexa and so on, or driverless cars, I mean, we're talking about stuff that clearly is in a different category. But that's when absolutely not only are you doing Python, you're doing deep learning. I think it's fair to say that SPSS is just not a deep learning resource. It can do neural nets, but it can't do deep learning. So the moment you start heading down that deep learning path, what Jeff Hinton, so-called godfather of AI, would call a shallow neural net, right? SPSS modeler, in fact, SPSS statistics can do shallow neural nets, but they can't do deep learning. So any of that video, image, audio, that's when SPSS is not going to be a good fit, and you're going to want to learn Python. The other reason too, I guess I'm giving Zechariah quite a bit of an answer here, but in general, we were saying if you're going to be a full-time data scientist, not a data analyst that occasionally dips into their data science toolkit, but you're a full-time machine learning resource, or what increasingly people are calling like machine learning engineer or ML ops, those kinds of things, you're absolutely living in the Python world, and you're not going to be as frequent a user of SPSS.
But I do want to mention, it's not. I know people who are full-time data people who do everything that they do in spreadsheets all day, every day. Now, it doesn't mean that they've gotten very sophisticated. And if you're in Excel, you start using VBA to automate your spreadsheets, and it makes your life so you're actually programming, but you're doing it in Excel. But there are certain people, I know billion-dollar businesses that run on Excel. And so they just stay there. I also know people who are analysts for global for giant global corporations, and they spend all day, every day in Power BI. That is the tool that their company uses. And so for them, there is no need ever to go to this other tool. And in fact, the funny thing about the people who I know who are using Power BI, what that also means is they're never doing inferential statistics. They're doing mostly data visualizations. They're mostly creating dashboards, and they're mostly doing crosstabs.
Yep. Well, and there's certain, I mean, this gets a little bit almost into, the history of the SPSS community, but there are a lot of organizations that do Power BI or database type things in SPSS, usually as a legacy thing, but they've kept the syntax over the years, so they're very, very happy with that. And anyone that's done a lot of SPSS outreach in whatever form, in my case, getting sent around to train, knows that federal and state government in particular, a lot of this has happened. Back when SPSS and SAS were the only game in town, there's a lot of legacy code around that's still being used. Now that doesn't mean that that's a criticism. They have it, so they use it. So the point is that proves that you can do a lot of database manipulation, even like dplyr type stuff in SPSS if that's your skill set. However, I think it's fair to say that what really is the determining factor of whether SPSS is really where you need to be is that you want to do intermediate to advanced statistics. Regression in a serious way, ANOVA, these kinds of things. There are lots of reasons to use SPSS, but if that describes you, if you're doing intermediate to advanced statistics stuff, it's one of the, I mean, it's built specifically for that. Doesn't mean that it's the only competitor in that space, but that's really where SPSS shines.
Yeah. And I want to say, Imule is asking about k-means clustering. I know I've done k-means clustering in SPSS, and I believe I may cover that in my introductory course. But off the top of my head, what kind of pointers are you looking for? I mean, I just know that it's possible.
Well, okay, you kind of set me up for this comment move. I would suggest my clustering course, right in LinkedIn Learning. You can't go wrong there. Yeah. So k-means is one of those topics that you could do in SPSS statistics, or you could do an SPSS modeler. So it actually provides a nice segue to that as well. Now, this particular course is part of the Megan. We haven't tried this before, but while I'm answering Muli's question, maybe we could put the learning path on screen. We've never tried to do switch to a web page. Well, but maybe we could try that. We could certainly put the link back in there, the learning path. But anyway, it's one of the courses in the learning path, and I chose to do it in SPSS Modeler. Yeah, the learning path would be a different link, but you'd be able to find it under there because the learning path will have Bart and mine. And once I answer Emily's question, Bart, I'm going to ask you to, yeah, that's the one, develop your skills in SPSS. That has courses by both of us. And Bart, since you have the first one, I want you to talk about that in a moment, but I'll finish answering Emily's question. So k-means clustering can be done in both SPSS statistics and SPSS modeler. Now, SPSS statistics looks like a spreadsheet. You know, when you're looking at it, you think you're looking at something like Excel. It's somewhat different in its design and how to kind of think SPSS thoughts, but it physically looks like Excel. SPSS modeler, on the other hand, looks like a flow chart. You're dragging symbols together with arrows. So why did I choose to do clustering in SPSS modeler for my LinkedIn Learning course? Well, I could have done either, but by doing it in modeler, it allowed me to talk about k-means, but also talk about association rules, which is like, if you like this book on Amazon, you also like that book on Amazon. And that's implemented in modeler, but not implemented in SPSS statistics. So I did it for that reason. And another reason is I demonstrate self-organizing maps, which is a specialized neural net for clustering. And that's supported in SPSS modeler, but not supported in SPSS statistics. So I chose to do it there. But Muli, if you or anyone wanted to understand k-means clustering and you watched the demonstration in SPSS modeler, you could apply that knowledge in SPSS statistics. You would just be going to a different set of menus. But the menus would look so similar after you get over the initial difference. And if I'm not mistaken, when I was at Franciscan, we were playing around with SPSS modeler anyway. So anyway, it's important to know the difference between those two. So Bart, why don't you talk a little bit about what you cover in the fundamentals course, because it's the kickoff course of our learning path.
Yeah. So my course is designed primarily to introduce people to SPSS. I mean, really, my main emphasis, most of my courses with LinkedIn are really sort of, this is what this thing even means. But with SPSS, which was my first course for LinkedIn about 12 years ago, and we've revised it several times, and we're going to have to revise it again later this year. But this is where I say what SPSS is, how to tell what the windows are, again, because you do have a data window that has the rows and columns that looks like a spreadsheet, but it also has a tab for adding labels and names to variables. I talk about ways that you can extend things. I give the basic elements of data visualizations, the very basic elements of it's not even fair to call it data wrangling, because mostly it's putting labels and names on variables and values, as well as how to split files and look at cases. And then basic recoding with dummy variables, with reversing variables, and preparing data for modeling. And then I do talk about k-means clustering, but for less than 6 minutes. And I talk about some regression models, including something that SPSS instituted several years ago. It's called automatic linear modeling.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
but anyhow, but mostly it's for people who have never seen SPSS, but have a need to answer some questions with data, and it's just a way to get them up and running with that as quickly as possible. The nice thing about that is it gets people started. Hopefully they feel comfortable with the interface. And I mentioned that there are these other things that you can do with it. Fortunately, that is what Keith has done so well, is by building on the additional functionality. So I'll tell you, for instance, I have never touched Modeler. I don't even know. I use Macintoshes. Does Modeler run on Mac?
I think it does now. Nicole, could you confirm that if you know? I'm sure it does. I will tell you that not
A
that many
no in the
years ago.
comments.
What's that?
I see a no in the comments.
I'm not. I want to double check that. Sarika,
Okay.
thank you
I
for
know things
that,
change.
but I want to double check that. I know that not that many years ago, I used to use Modeler almost every day. I don't anymore. My career's just gone in a different direction that I don't use it as often. But I used to have Windows on my Mac and launch Windows on my Mac on those during those hours during the workday that I was going to use SPSS Modeler. But we're going to be able to confirm this really quick, so everybody will be able to see that I'm typing here.
But my course is very introductory. If you've never used SPSS or you're wondering what it's about, my course will get you started with it and hopefully get you comfortable doing some of the most common basic tasks. And it's the one that I share with my colleagues, and especially with their students who are taking research classes. The trick, however, is there's a lot more you can do. And again, my course is pretty fundamental. Again, 5 minutes and 43 seconds on k-means clustering, which is why it's important to know that we have these other courses in the learning path, several by Keith, that are going to allow you to build on what you've learned in the introductory course.
Okay, so first I want to confirm that yes, and my IBM colleagues are probably going to say, what, did you not have your caffeine today? That I didn't off the top of my head be able to confirm that it's on the Mac. It absolutely runs on the Mac. Part of one of the reasons that I paused is that, give it another 5 years, and I think IBM is going to move away from, now I'm going to make a pronouncement, which my IBM friends might not be crazy about either, but everything's really moving to the cloud. So, I think it's safe to say that we're definitely moving towards, now how rapidly we're moving towards this isn't clear, but we're moving towards SPSS statistics subscription and SPSS modeler subscription, which is really browser based. So we're not there yet. So at the moment there's subscription, this is your whole welcome to the SPSS universe, which I'm familiar with that video. And it takes you 5 or 6 minutes, and you do so very efficiently, but it takes 5 or 6 minutes to walk through all these different versions and all the complexity. It's not easy to do that in 6 minutes. So I know that you must have prepared, how am I going to walk everybody through all these branching left and right turns? And it's because we're just in a moment of transition where things are moving to the cloud, and the idea that you download this huge software and it lives on your laptop is undergoing a real revolution. But can confirm SPSS Modeler doesn't absolutely work on the Mac, and it's probably been almost 10 years that that's the case. 5 to 8 minimum, but maybe almost a decade. If we go back 10 years, that's when I had to do parallels. Parallels being a way of having 2 operating systems on one laptop. Thus the name. So I want to comment on something that you said during fundamentals, and then everybody, we're down to about the last 10 minutes. So please be hitting us with your questions. It takes a few seconds for it to get into the comments, and then it takes a few seconds for us to spot them and decide which one of us is going to take the question. So please hit us with your questions now. It's really important that we can help you out with with some quick Q&A. But I wanted to pick up on something you said about what we in the SPSS community would call the variable view, but you were describing it. It's really the metadata of your SPSS data. And I think it's fair to say that that's a big difference between SPSS and Excel. If you want to, sum a column or do an average, it behaves quite differently in SPSS and Excel, but those kinds of tasks, just do them wherever you're comfortable. But if you have missing data, if you have nulls, or if you have survey data, like not applicable or refuse to answer, now you're in territory where SPSS can do things that Excel can't, because SPSS has metadata. And gosh, I'm sure you've met folks like this too, Bart. They'll say, oh, is it really important that I declare my missing data? I'm not quite sure how that works. Can I just kind of blow that off? No, you can't. So if you don't know what missing data is in this context, don't walk to Bart's class, because that is a critical SPSS skill. Bart, do you know in the For Dummies books how they have the part of tens? Have you ever seen that? I don't know if you've ever read For Dummies. Yeah. But it's kind of a fun thing that as a For Dummies author, I'm required to do, which is in the end of it, you have to decide which topics work well as a top 10 list. And, we'll have, top 10 warning, don't do this. And, common mistakes that really will cause you trouble, and not declaring missing values definitely makes the top 10.
And we're going to add, you need to know that there's more than one kind of missing value. You need to know the ones that they were supposed to answer, but they didn't, and the ones where you never asked it to them because it wasn't relevant. Those need to be parsed out. And it's funny. It's really easy to set. Now you can do those. That's when you can't do that in Excel, unless you do a very complicated if-then statement. But what's funny is the variable view, where you can put in not just what the missing values are, but you can also specify the type of the variable. Is it quantitative? Is it ordinal? Is it whatever? And you can put in the labels. And so that's a funny. So your variable can have a name like Q01 for first question, but then you can tell SPSS, well, Q01 actually means what's your name. It can do something like that. And I think I spent over a year in R thinking, where do I specify the labels? How can I specify the labels? Without realizing R just doesn't do that. And so that is something from SPSS. It's a little bit different. I like it in SPSS. Hopefully you've been able to use both the variable names, which is the thing that's like the Q01, Q02, or some other cryptic name. I use those because I have people entering stuff manually in spreadsheets. This is when it's very small class projects. And it's really easy to propagate a structured variable name across the top of a spreadsheet. So Q01, Q02, then you just drag it and it will continue that. It makes it really easy to expand. But when we get to SPSS, we need to give it its real name, but it keeps that other one underneath. It's also like if you have a rating scale, like 1 strongly agreed, 1 strongly disagreed, to 5 strongly agree. You enter it as the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but you tell SPSS 1 equals this, 2 equals this, 5 equals this. And you can do that in something like R or Python, but it's a little bit complicated. But that functionality is central, built into SPSS. It makes it a lot easier to enter the data. SPSS likes numbers. And so you enter things as numbers, and then you can give it these text variables, these text labels on top. To clean it up. Anyhow, that's something that I find is very helpful for my students and in my collaborations as well.
Well, I had someone in one of my SPSS training classes once that had 1 through 10 data, so kind of a net promoter score type data. But 11 was the code that they typed in when someone refused to answer, right? In other words, they were, it was a survey, and it didn't it didn't say 11 on the survey, but it said, you know, if they, you know, if they rate refused or if they leave it blank, type in an 11. And they said,
My
can't I
initial
just
immediate
throw that in
reaction,
there?
that should be a 98 or a 99,
Yeah,
not
yeah,
not
of
an
course,
11.
which would be a lot better. But then the point is, if that's not declared as missing, you're pulling that average up with people that probably are not your promoters, right? They refuse to answer, and that's like really, really bad news. Yeah, so that's, in fact, you know, LinkedIn Learning, one thing that's great about it is that if someone's never heard of missing data declarations in the variable view, I'd encourage them right after we're done today, watch just that one video in your course. They can eventually go back and watch the whole thing, but it's a
By the
substantial. What's that?
by the way, Keith, I'll mention one thing about missing data. You know, my immediate reaction was like, you can't use 11 for missing data. That's just not allowed. I say it either has to be 98 or 99 or 998 and 999. And I'll tell
Yeah,
you,
yeah,
there's a funny thing about it. Aside from the fact that those are practices, it means that if you have rating scale data that's like on a 1 to 10, and you suddenly have an average of 17.8, you will know that you had some missing data entered as like 998 and nobody declared it properly. And so using these really extreme values to code your missing data is helpful because it throws things off so much that it makes it easier to see if you made a mistake.
yeah. No, absolutely. And if someone's doing the negative 99, they might have a net promoter score of minus
Yeah,
1.5, and you know that something's not right. At least I hope.
yeah.
I hope that jumps off the screen at everybody. This has been really great, everybody. I would love to take a closing question. Well, let's just, again, since it would be lovely if folks would join us for check out the courses. We can just, I'm just kind of looking at it now. It kicks off with your course. Now, your course is a substantial, in fact, the first two courses in the learning path are substantial. If they get through those two, they are really well on their way
Yeah, it's almost
because
6 hours.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a substantial course. And my regression course is 4 hours. You know, when I first became a LinkedIn Learning author, I wasn't sure if a course of that length would be encouraged, but I knew that there's a lot more to regression than people think they know, right? So if you just did a introduction to regression that was 30 or 45 minutes, I knew that most people would probably just do that and think I've learned everything I need to know about regression. So I said, if I don't squeeze these other really important topics into the intro course, people might not even know that those additional concerns exist. Those two courses, your fundamentals and my regression course, are in SPSS statistics. And then we didn't talk a ton about modeler today, but the other courses after that, I've done in modeler for reasons that we've hinted at. So there's the classification modeling course. I'm not even sure how familiar you are with what I cover in that one, Bart. What it basically is, it's all the different ways that you can predict whether, a binary, outcome, like fraud, not fraud, or what have you. So that includes things like decision trees that are kind of more the machine learning side of the house, but it also includes things like logistic regression. So what I do with intro classification is I basically say, wow, there's so many things you can do with traditional machine learning where there's a dozen algorithms to choose from. And then I just go on from there. I've got two courses on decision trees, the clustering course that we talked about. What am I forgetting? I think that's it. Yeah, classification, decision trees, then advanced decision trees, and then clustering. And that's a substantial total investment, almost 18 hours. But gosh, you would learn a lot in that amount of time. So keep your eyes on both of our feeds. Do you have a new release or a revision coming out anytime soon?
Not, I have to think about that. We are in the planning stages. The SPSS course is going to get thoroughly re-recorded. And truthfully, we're going to try to cut it down from 6 hours. But that's also because it's part of a learning path. And we know that the learning paths are going to be able to give the detail that people need. I have several other data courses that are all going to get at least partially revised to address generative AI.
Oh, wow.
You
So
can't not talk about it.
So what's your number one course suggestion out of your courses? If someone's a statistics person now, but they're intrigued with machine learning, what would be the number one course you'd
Data
recommend?
science fundamentals.
Oh,
Data science
fantastic.
fundamentals.
Yep. And I think that's one of your most popular courses, right? That's a super popular
Yep.
course. Yeah. So that would be great. Check out Bart's Data Science Fundamentals if that describes you. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Please follow both of us on LinkedIn so that you get all kinds of news on these kinds of things. I hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. You know, an hour went by really, really quick. So take care, everybody, and stay in touch in our LinkedIn feeds. Thanks, Bart.
All right, folks. Bye.